Shalom and welcome to Yeshiva B'nai Noach. I'm Tom Averna, and this is Intro to Judaism, another class that I've offered in the past. We'll be taking a very brief look at Judaism, not as a religion, because it really isn't one, as we'll talk about in more detail later, but as a group of people, a tribal confederation, a nation who've been singled out for a specific purpose by God. Just what that purpose is and the proofs of it will be the scope of this class. That proof will be demonstrated through the history, writings, festivals, life cycles, and beliefs of this extraordinary people, a people often referred to as the chosen people, not because they are better than anyone else, but because they've been chosen for a mission. This class assumes a belief in one God and that our only reliable record of this God's communication with mankind is through the words of the Torah. And if this is not a belief that you share, then I would simply ask you to suspend disbelief for this class, or you may not get very much out of it. We'll address some proofs regarding our foundational statements, but mostly that also is not the scope of this class. These are the books primarily used in the compilation of the material for the class. I may not always give immediate credit to the sources, but in general, please understand that unless I say otherwise, all of the material is from the great minds who authored the books and not from my own mind. Since this is not a live class, there won't be a time in class for side discussion, so please put your questions in the comments and I or someone else will try to answer. As I've said before, I'm not a rabbi nor a scholar. I'm simply a student, so I do welcome any positive corrections you might want to make to my presentation. It's possible there are mistakes here, but I ask that you also give a source or sources for your correction. The history of a people is a shared experience. It's a common bond that includes good times and bad times. It's what molds a people into a tribe or nation. It's the struggles and surviving those struggles that truly gives a disparate group of people a common identity. Now, although this class is labeled history, all of the classes that come under this heading, all of the classes in this class come under this heading. History includes not just chronological passage of time, but everything that is shared by this people. History, including the land, language, and writings, our culture encompassed in our lifestyles, festivals, beliefs, past and future, are all part of the tapestry that binds a group of people together into a nation. Let's briefly summarize these aspects of history, and then we'll look more in depth at some of them later. So, language. For Israel, there's only one language that is common throughout the years, and that's Hebrew. Although Hebrew as a spoken language was only revised in the late 1800s, for the observant Jew it was always the only language used for spiritual study. It's a language steeped in mystery and depth, and it is, according to our beliefs, the language of God and the angels. Aramaic comes a close second, and although most of what we know about the language came from our Babylonian captivity, Abraham was also from that same area, from Hebrew, and most likely also spoke Aramaic. So the history of both languages is intertwined. Still, it is Hebrew that survived till today, and like the Jewish people themselves, could only have been preserved through the miraculous intervention and intention of God, which should say something to us about God's intention. Other languages shared by a large group of Jews at various times are Ladino, which is a joining of Spanish and Hebrew, Yiddish, which is a combining of Hebrew and German with many additions of Russian, Polish, and even American borrowed words. Now, we won't spend a lot of time in this area here because that is covered more completely in my Hebrew and mystical Hebrew classes. In terms of writings, the Torah, of course, is the heart and soul of Israel. All other literature is somehow connected to these 5 books that we believe were authored by Moses, as given to him by God over 4,000 years ago. Everything else is commentary, sometimes called the oral law. Most famous is the Talmud, which is itself made up of 3 other books, the Mishnah and its commentary companion, the Gemara, as well as spatterings of midrash or stories. The midrash also stands on its own as a collection of tales and fables told over the years to encourage and strengthen and teach us Torah principles. And then there are the mystical streams of writing, collectively known as Kabbalah. Third thing is the land. There's only one land that belongs to Israel, and that is the home of our beloved capital and origin of our faith. Jerusalem in Israel. This was our homeland for thousands of years and our heart's home for thousands more during our exiles. Quote, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory even at my happiest hour." Unquote. We came to the land from our enslavement in Egypt, but it was a land promised to Abraham and his descendants centuries before. There were very few times of peace while we were there, but still it is our home. We began under the rule of judges, and then kings, and then foreign domination, followed by brief exiles, and finally under the rule of priests who tried to be kings, and by a convert named Herod, who opened the door to the Romans, who forced us out of our homeland into the exile we still endure. 1900 years later, we return to our land, but for many Jews, it's still not our home. We believe with the coming of Mashiach, may it soon become soon, that his will change. Lifestyles, well, we share a common culture with festivals and celebrations and rituals that memorialize the many troubles and triumphs we've endured. This also involves our shared beliefs in God, Torah, love, and compassion, good deeds, and prayer, and, of course, Mashiach. We also share a hope for the future where we'll finally live in peace on our land. For some, this is a hope for a future time that we ourselves will bring about, but for some, this is a hope for a deliverer, a teacher, and a king who is a descendant of King David and will rule over us in justice and bring us all closer to God and bring God closer to us. This person is the Mashiach. As I said before, we are the chosen people, but this is not a title of arrogance. Many Jews throughout the ages have echoed the words of Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof, who said, "But once in a while, couldn't you choose someone else?" Being chosen does not make you special, just set apart for a purpose. In our case, that purpose seems to be to suffer and die, not only for our own sins, but for the sins of the world as well. Our mission is to demonstrate and teach the truths of the one God. I believe our mission is to become the priests and kings of the world, but primarily the priests, as our mission has been defined over the years. Nor were we chosen to found a world religion. Ours is a tribal identity. We only accept converts begrudgingly, and even then, it is often proved more problematic than helpful. Our tradition tells us that God warned Moses against taking the mixed multitude with him, but he was certain it would be good for them. Instead, they led us to our great sin in the desert with the golden calf. Judaism is a tribal identity and was never destined to be a world religion. Still, I maintain that Hebraism, a term I borrowed from the 19th century rabbi who spoke so eloquently about Israel's relation to the Noachides, Eliyahu ben Amozig, a term that represents a more accurate definition of the collection of beliefs handed down from the prophets and sages of the children of Israel, who today are known as Jews, but more accurately might be described as Hebrews, after our father Abraham. Back to my point about converts. I believe that there may have been very few actual converts to Judaism. First of all, because it's not a religion that one can convert to. And secondly, because there are so many millions of Hebrews who are hidden, lost to their faith because of pogroms and exiles and forced conversions. It is possible that the way these millions can finally return to their forgotten heritage is what we label as conversion. This, to me, is the true work of Hebraism's command to reach out to the Gentile world with the teachings of the Noahide law. The primary purpose is to allow these hidden Jews to return. I speak of this in more detail in the Noahide class, but the point here is that our history is often shaped for better or worse by these so-called converts. We'll take a look at some of these as we continue this journey of discovery. All of this taken together has become for us our tradition. Without it, we are lost, and our life as a people is as shaky as, well, a fiddler on the roof. So now let's take a closer look at our history. This will be a brief tour, and the purpose is to reveal a people who began with a calling forth of a chosen one and a miraculous birth, and remains today as a testament to the power of God's love. The rabbis teach that just as there were 6 days of creation, there will be 6 millenniums before the coming of Mashiach, and a final 1,000 years of peace, or Shabbat. They've divided the six into three major sections: 2,000 years of chaos, 2,000 years of Torah, and 2,000 years of Mashiach. Now let's break that down a little bit more. The first 2,000 years you know pretty well from the book of Genesis. What you may not have thought about is the purpose of this history telling. Most people think of this as simply a telling of the history of the world's beginning, but that really isn't true. It only very lightly touches on any of the world's history. The one and only true purpose of Torah is to chronicle the history of Israel. Everything in Genesis is written to lead us up to the emergence of Abraham. But this was indeed a time of chaos that culminated with the destruction of the world. There's a rabbinic teaching that the creation story is also the story of mankind and our history. It's the first place that we're shown that the writings of Torah are not meant to be taken as history, only and generally not as history, or not as history at all, but as a prophecy and warning of what is to come. No other religion or belief system provides a guidebook and a letter that is addressed to all of mankind. Here's one way to interpret the creation story in this manner. What if the first 3 days represent the cosmic cycle of creation, giving us a blueprint for the history of mankind from beginning to end? Here's what that looks like, according to the teachings of the rabbis, that there are 3 cycles we must go through to get to our perfection, as mentioned before: the age of chaos, the age of Torah, and the age of Messiah. The first day of creation was the creation of light and dark, as symbolized by the choice of Adam to disobey God and therefore bring duality into the world. But it is also the time of tohu vibohu, the time of chaos, where we might see the chaos that brings forth the light and the darkness. This light is not the light that any of us have seen, but it will be returned to us in the time of Messiah. That is the secret of God separating the light from the darkness. The darkness remained for the first 2,000 years of our history, but the light was taken away for another time. The second day was the separation of the waters, and again its parallel in our history is the resultant flood to eliminate the chaos and start fresh. But the waters also represent Torah. If again this is not the actual creation of waters that we know about, since the sun and moon and stars have yet to be created, this is the second 2,000 years known as the age of Torah. Again, there's a separation as God removed the complete understanding of the Torah to a time yet to come. But what was left would enable us to be sustained until the end. The third day seems to be the actual creation of the earth. Some have interpreted this as proof that early man believed that everything revolved around the earth, since it appears to be created here before the sun, moon, and stars. But is there another meaning, since the truth is we have still yet to see that creation of the sun, moon, and stars, which would be required to allow the vegetation of this day to grow and thrive? Perhaps this day is a prophecy of the third age of man, the age known as the age of Mashiach. The Torah has now sprouted on the earth and brought forth many teachings. All of these teachings contain seeds or truths that will lead us to the final revelation to come. As those who have tended a garden know, plants left to themselves can become a jumbled mess. But with cultivation and care, that mess can become a beautiful garden. This is our destiny as God, through the Torah, becomes our gardener. There's also another way to view the 6 days, as each one representing a day or 1,000 years. In this way, day 1 represents Sunday, the first 1,000 years, as the life of Adam, and the second 1,000 years, Monday, as the life of Noah and his sons. Noah and his 3 sons were given the first covenant with its sign in the rainbow. Just as the rainbow is made up of 7 colors, so too were 7 commandments given to Noah and his descendants. Some of these laws are in Genesis 8 and 9, the laws of blood and purity, but other laws were given prior to this in Genesis. You can learn more about this in the Noahide class. These laws were for all mankind to follow, and these would be the laws that Abraham would teach, although he also had the understanding that a different covenant would be made with his descendants. And this would end the second day, as Abraham was said to have been born in 1948 and would begin his work and calling at the beginning of the third day. We know also the rise of four great empires during this time: the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Chaldeans, and the Egyptians. We also know that a grandson of Ham took the land that would become Israel for himself, and even though it was outside the allotted territory given to his grandfather after the flood, the name of the land was his name, Canaan. Now we move into the third day. Isaac would be born just into the third millennium in the year 2048. He was the child of promise, as God had made two promises to Abraham regarding the land and his descendants based on the condition of obedience and trust. This was the beginning of the second age of man, the age of Torah. We learn along with Jacob and his children another very important lesson related to this age, and that is that righteousness involves suffering, as over and over the patriarchs must undergo many trials. We also learn from the patriarchs the importance of trust. They made mistakes, and they had their times of doubt, but through it all they believed that God's word was truth and that they never completely abandoned their faith even in the darkest times. We read the stories of the sons of Jacob and wonder how they could do such things to their brother. But then we must wonder how we could treat God with the callousness and indifference that we often do. Joseph in the well must have doubted that his life would be worth very much, but even in slavery he maintained his faith and trust in God. When he was raised to the dizzying heights of power, he could have taken vengeance on his brothers, but instead he elevated them along with him. This, too, is a lesson in forgiveness and love that we learn. So the third day is a busy one, as one of God's times is preparing the tribes of Israel to become the nation of Israel. So as we move from the night to the sunrise of the third day, we see the children of Israel being delivered from Egypt, taken on the journey to the promised land, but first they're brought face to face with God and accept upon themselves and their children the conditions of a new covenant at Mount Sinai. Just as Abraham brought a great light to the people, allowing them to escape the chaos of the world, so too Moses would bring an even greater light to the Israelites and ultimately begin to fulfill the promise made to Abraham regarding the land of Israel. And by the early afternoon of the third day, we took possession of at least a portion of our inheritance. The last half of the third day saw us settling into our land. First, we were ruled by judges, but only when a particular crisis arose. But still during this 400 years, we were constantly reminded of God's protection. We don't know much about how Torah was taught during this time, but the fact that we find the nation continuing gives us the understanding that it was being taught. But soon God must have realized that he needed to communicate his laws and teachings on a more personal level, and the great prophet Samuel moved from his position as the last judge to become the first prophet. As the last judge, Samuel was considered the first prophet of the age of prophets, although many before him had the ability to prophesy. Moses is considered the greatest of the prophets, but it was during this time that there was actually a school of prophets established, and thousands were trained and used by God throughout Israel. And for the next 400 years, taking us into the fourth day, we would have the advice and teachings of thousands of prophets throughout the land of Israel. We have the records of 16 of those prophets. Malachi was the last prophet and the first high priest after the times for the kings. It would be the combined role of high priest and the Sanhedrin who would continue to guide Israel spiritually, but the office of prophet was removed from Israel after the Babylonian captivity. We also have the start of kingship in Israel that would last for 400 years. With this kingship came the promise of an eternal kingdom through a descendant of David, but this would be a distant hope, as the land would see a parade of kings, and most of them not following the advice of the prophets or their God. But still, there was always hope, and one of the last kings of Judah would stimulate the prophet Isaiah to make many prophecies about this king as the promised Messiah. Hezekiah seemed to live up to that title, restoring Torah knowledge and temple worship and cleansing the land of idolatry. He saw many miracles, including the defeat of the vast Assyrian army that came against Jerusalem without a single Jewish life lost. But sadly, Hezekiah would not bear the mantle of Messiah, and within a few decades we would be forced from our land by the Babylonians. The time of kings lasted roughly 450 years. Judah had 20 kings, including one queen. 8 of them were righteous, ruling 263 years, with David and Solomon's rule adding another 80. So over 300 years of righteous rulers in Israel. We tend to lose sight of that, as most of our focus in Torah is on the unrighteous kings. Israel, on the other hand, had 19 kings, with none considered righteous. In Judah, of course, the kings were from the tribe of Judah. In Ephraim, or rather in Israel, I should say, they were from the tribe of Joseph, or Ephraim. And this will be an interesting point we'll talk about more in the Messiah class, as the possibility of 2 Messiahs exists for our future, one from the tribe of Judah and one from the tribe of Joseph, either Ephraim or Manasseh, most likely Ephraim. Again, we'll talk about that more in the Messiah class. As the third day in the age of Torah was drawing to a close, we saw the exile of the northern tribes, finally the exile of Judah by the Babylonians, and then the Persians, who rose up next. It was in Persia that we became known as Jews, since we were from the Judean exile. The northern tribes were lost, although not really, and it appears Josephus would speak of them as being in the north in his days, and as a numerous and powerful people. He may have been referring to the Parthians and the Scythians, but that is the story for another time. That time, by the way, is in the Noahide class. This then is a look at the times that we're talking about. Again, we're still in Wednesday, the age of Torah, and the Assyrian exile took place first, taking the northern tribes away. We had then the Babylonian exile as the second exile, and at that time the first temple would be destroyed. And that's the end of the biblical narrative. From that point on, we have to look elsewhere for some of the history that we'll be talking about. We also have then, during this time, Age of Torah, the rise of the Babylonian Empire, followed by the rise of the Persian Empire, which is where we were allowed to return to the land of Israel from. The last moments of the fourth day in the Age of Torah are probably the richest in the story of Israel since King David's time. Most of this is not chronicled in the Torah or Tanakh, but only in the apocryphal work known as the Maccabees. The Babylonian captivity ended 70 years after it had begun, around the year 3411 or 350 BCE. King Darius, who's believed to be the son of Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus, allowed Ezra to lead a group of refugees back to Israel and begin the process of rebuilding the temple. It's said that only about 20% of the Jews made the choice to return. The rest stayed in the U.S. of Babylon. During the next 25 years, the temple is rebuilt and the Great Sanhedrin is established, allowing the Torah and its laws to once again begin to be followed. But this brief time of respite will be interrupted with the coming of Alexander. What happens next we know mostly from the history of Josephus. According to Josephus, Alexander was preparing to invade Asia and sent to Israel to provide arms and provisions to his men. The high priest, Simon the Just, responded that he had made an oath to Darius not to bear arms against him, and he would not break that oath while Darius was still alive. Naturally, Alexander was furious and intended to eliminate these pesky Jews. As his army approached, Simon, dressed in purple and scarlet, and led the procession of priests in white linen, because God had come to Simon in a dream and advised him not to fear Alexander, but to open the city gates and go out to greet him as one would a friend. At the sight of this procession, Alexander halted his army and went ahead alone to meet the high priest. You can imagine this scene, and it's just a very touching moment. Alexander afforded Simon, the high priest, every courtesy. He later explained that he had a dream where he met the man dressed exactly as Simon was dressed, and was told by God that if he gave honor to this man, he would be given victory and obtain dominion in Asia. After Alexander died, the kingdom was divided among his generals. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus took Asia, Israel was at the crossroads, as always has been the case in the Middle East, and was dominated by both at different times. Most of the time, the Asian Seleucids were in control of the land and, like Alexander, generally treated them with tolerance and respect. But that would change with the rise of the Seleucid leader Antiochus Epiphanes around 3621 or 140 before the Common Era. Antiochus didn't want to wipe out the Jews, just their religion. As long as they would give up on their beliefs and embrace the Greek gods and philosophies, they could all just get along. Many Jews at the time wanted that promised life of peace and were willing to sacrifice their God to get it. Not so a descendant of Levi and Aaron named Mattathias. So here we see the Greek Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, covering the land of Egypt, and for a long time that included the land of Israel, and the Seleucid Empire, which was much larger and run by the Greek leader, Seleucid. These, of course, both were generals in Alexander's army. And then the other generals had smaller provinces towards Greece. But these are the two that primarily will be in the area of Israel and deal with Israel's history for the most part. So you can see the whole power of the Greek Empire remained for many years after Alexander and involved Israel's history. So before we get to the Maccabee story and conclude the Age of Torah, let's take another look at all the empires that have tried to dominate or destroy Israel. We're still here. They're gone. As the popular saying goes regarding pretty much all Jewish festivals, they tried to kill us. They failed. Let's eat. I also want to give my favorite quote again, as I managed to fit this quote into just about every class I offer. It's from Mark Twain, and it goes, "If the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous, dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in the world in all the ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Romans followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All the things are mortal, but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?" Unquote. In a nutshell, this is the history and legacy of Israel, which is still true today. So taking a look here, we have these are the major empires. Now, there were other empires that existed during this time. Again, they appeared and they disappeared. Israel remained. So the first major empire was in Egypt, followed by the Assyrians as the second. The third empire taking over from the Assyrians was the Babylonians. From there, we have the Persian Empire, and then the Seleucid Greek Empire, which included, as I showed you on the map before, both Seleucid as well as Ptolemy as the fifth empire, and then the last empire to interact with Israel and in one way or another try to destroy them was the Roman Empire, which for the most part has also disappeared or been eliminated. So all of these empires have been a part of the history of Israel, and somehow this small group of troublemakers has survived and thrived through 2,000 years of exile. The Dalai Lama gathered a Jewish leadership conference to hear how they did it. How did they survive in exile, in diaspora? Jews or Israelites comprise an overwhelming majority in Nobel Prize winners, as Mark Twain pointed out, and medical, scientific, business, many other trades around the world. Both the Christians and Muslims have a much bigger population, but the history of both reveal that much of their growth was through forced conversions and violent rulership. Because of that, the numbers of Israelites may be substantially higher than anyone but God knows. Arguably, the concept of Messiah began among the Jews, so the roots and truth of this subject should be found there more so than in any other religion, who at best chose to copy the idea. This Messiah fervor was certainly prevalent in the first century in Israel. And again, we'll look more at that in the Messiah class. So let's get back now to our look at history, and we're still on the fourth day, Wednesday, taking a look at events that happened at the end of the fourth day. This was a time of unraveling of the age of Torah, creating the definite need and desire for a promised Messiah. Between the first century and modern times, Judaism would see more than 50 Messiah claimants, with 5 being widely supported. Of course, those would be Jesus, Bar Kokhba, Shabbatai Zvi, the Vilna Gaon, and in recent times, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. We have then in this time the Maccabees and Mattathias and his revolt killed the Greeks. Hanukkah and the Maccabees began a rebellion that would be won against all odds against the powerful Greek army. It would be Judah Maccabee who would be victorious following the death of his father. The temple, which had been polluted by the Greeks, was cleaned and restored after the miracle of the oil celebrated in the festival of Hanukkah. Thus began the reign of the descendants of Mattathias on the throne of Israel for almost 100 years. But these were the descendants of Levi and Aaron, and herein is the problem that existed. And sadly, the revolt of Mattathias, as noble as it was at the beginning, ended in a not so noble way. They were the descendants of Levi and Aaron and not Judah. And at first they were careful not to proclaim themselves king, but high priest. But that quickly changed. So here's a listing of these priest kings. We begin with, of course, the leader, Mattathias ben Yochanan, a priest from Modin, northwest of Jerusalem. He was the patriarch of the family who began the revolt against Antiochus IV Epiphanes and his Seleucid successors in 167 BCE. He had 5 sons. Only one of them would survive the war. Those sons were John, Gadi, Simon, also known as Tassi, Judas, Maccabeus, Eleazar, also known as Avaron, and Jonathan, known as Aphus, all of that from 1 Maccabees chapter 2. So the son Judah Maccabee takes command after his father's death. The third son, he was the third son of Mattathias. He succeeded his father as the main leader of the revolt against the Seleucid Greeks and the Hellenizing faction of Jews. And sadly, the fight that Mattathias and Judah continued, and his sons, were not just against the Greeks. They were also against the Hellenistic Jews, the ones who supported the Greeks. But at any rate, they were successful in rededicating the Temple of Jerusalem in 164. That's from 1 Maccabees 3:1 through 9:22. In 160, we see that Judah is killed. His brother, Jonathan, now takes the position of high priest. And from 160 to 142, he's followed. He's also killed. And his brother, Simon, the last surviving son, ruled from 142 to 134, He started his rule as high priest. He wins full independence at this time for Israel from the Seleucids and expands Israel. The Roman Senate, Rome was beginning to be a power at this time. The Roman Senate recognized Israel, but he was murdered by his son-in-law, Ptolemy, in Egypt, along with all but one son. That one son was protected by Rome. Yochanan, the surviving son of Simon, appointed high priest. In 134, he would rule for about 30 years. But he was also appointed as ethnarch of Israel. Again, not king, but as ruler in Israel. And Simon was said to have the gift of prophecy. There was a conflict between the Pharisees and the Sadducees at this time. The son of Johanan was the first to claim the title of king, and he took the throne from his mother. He killed her and imprisoned his brothers and killed one of them. Then Alexander Jonathan, seized the throne, and he was in 103. Now we're getting towards the end of the what is known as the BCE era, the before the Common Era. So this is 100 years before the first century. At any rate, Alexander Janai seized the throne. He was politically successful, but not morally. He greatly expanded the kingdom, even beyond David's Israel. He conquered and forced the Idumeans to convert. This is one of the only times that we are aware of in Israel's history that they actually forced conversion, and they did that with the Idumeans. Later they relented, but the Idumeans continued in their conversion process. That's part of another history, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Many in Israel didn't see him as a worthy ruler and complained against him. So he killed 6,000 of these dissenters, including many, if not most, of the Pharisees. Many more fled Israel, ending up in Egypt, in Alexandria, or they primarily where they ended up. And there was a 6 to 8 year civil war. Alexander, king, is said to have died from his own excesses. His wife, Alexandra, also known as Salome, would assume the throne from her husband, and she ruled from 76 to 67. One of the very few queens in Israel's history. And actually, she was a very good ruler. She made peace with the Pharisees, brought them back. Her brother was a leader of the Pharisees. Her son Hyrcanus was made high priest. But then trouble continued. In 67, Aristobulus II, Judah, also known as Judah, proclaimed himself king. His brother Hyrcanus II, these are all children of Alexander and Alexandra, appeals to Rome. And Pompey takes him captive to Rome, where he dies in 40 BCE. So this is Aristobulus, Judah. Then his brother Jonathan would be restored to the throne. He ruled from 63 to 40, known as Hyrcanus II. And the cost for his being restored to the throne was that Rome now annexed Israel. So it is thanks to the Maccabee Jonathan, whose heritage gave up the Greek control of Israel, but exchanged it for Roman control. He was appointed high priest and ethnarch by Julius Caesar. He was executed by Herod, who would come into the scene shortly, in 30 BCE. Antigonus Matthew, who was a son of Aristobulus II, again, hard to keep track of all of the players, but Aristobulus II was one of the other two sons of Alexander and Alexandra, who was deposed by Jonathan, who is now deposed, and the son of Aristobulus takes revenge for his father, disfigures Hyrcanus so he can't hold the title of high priest, and he ended up being beheaded by the Roman Senate. Now steps into the picture Herod the Great. Herod would rule from 37 BCE to 4 CE. So 41 years Herod rules. He was a great friend of Rome, and as I mentioned, he was a convert Idumean. So he was Jewish in the sense that he converted, but many Jews had a problem with that, and that became a sore point for Herod throughout his reign, because Herod's desire was to be the king in Israel, but again, not from the tribe of Judah, and a convert. At any rate, Mark Antony and Augustus support Herod and his claim as king. He was, as I said, a friend of Rome, and during his reign there was relative stability with Rome. But his excesses and executions, especially of family members, became tiresome to both Israel and to Rome, to the point where the quote became popular in Rome that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son. He was the result of the first and only time, as I mentioned, Israel practiced forced conversions on Herod's people, but even after the enforcement was no longer upheld, the Idumeans for the most part remained Jews. Herod was constantly trying to prove himself Jewish to Israel, and that was partly why he rebuilt the temple so magnificently. But in the end, and there's another story about that with one of the Pharisees that he had killed, just as Alexander had done, many Pharisees, but one he kept and blinded, and this person became a friend, if sort of Herod's, and advised him that if he wanted to atone for the blood that he had shed, that he needed to rebuild the temple. So that's kind of the story behind that. But in the end, unfortunately, or not fortunately or unfortunately, but at any rate, Herod would be not remembered as a Jewish king. So then we have the coming in of the Roman Empire after Herod's death. The relationship between Rome and Israel became much more fragmented, moving us into the first century and the time of a lot of turmoil and trouble. So the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, but the Jews were still in their homeland. By the second century, the Zealots were in control, and their leader now was a man known as Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kokhba. But the great Rabbi Akiva believed him to be the Messiah and named him Bar Kokhba, meaning son of the star. This Jewish general won many great victories against the Romans, but ultimately the rabbis, other than Akiva, determined that he could not be the Messiah, and like Yeshua before him, they sacrificed him to Rome for the sake of keeping the peace. When he was killed, his messianic claim died also, and this was the final straw for Rome. However, it was a time that they were exiled, and they had exiled the Jews from their homeland and renamed the country Palestine after Israel's hated enemies, the Philistines. So the whole point of the name of Palestine that was attributed, and even in today's time is said to be because of the Palestinians. No, the original name was after the Philistines, who no longer exist. They're one of those many empires that came against Israel, failed, and are no longer in existence. But that was where the name Palestine came from. It was kind of a joke that Rome played on Israel so that they would no longer have a homeland that had their name attached to it. So now it was understood that Judaism would have to change to survive. Just before the last Sanhedrin was disbanded, Judah the prince, a great rabbi and descendant of King David himself, convinced the Sanhedrin that we must do something previously forbidden to do, and that was to make the oral law a written law. The oral law would need to be written down. From this came the body of work called the Mishnah, which was an explanation and discussion of the 613 laws found in the Torah. This work was started in 189 CE, or 3949 in the Hebrew calendar, bringing the second age of Torah to a close. And now we're into the time of the diaspora after the end of the great Sanhedrin. Now we move into more modern times. We move into Thursday, the fifth day into the years 4000 to 5000 on the Hebrew calendar, and now we begin the age of Messiah. The Jews who were expelled from Israel for whatever reason wandered in two directions. One group went north and ended up in Russia, Germany, Poland, throughout Eastern Europe. These were called the Ashkenazi Jews, after the Hebrew name for Germany. The other group went west to Spain and France, and these were called Sephardi, the Hebrew name for Spain. Of course, many of the Sephardi also stayed in the Middle East as well. There were also many who, as I said, stayed in the Middle East, settling in Persia, which would become Iran and Iraq. Iran primarily. Remember that a large portion of Jews had never left Babylon and Persia, so there was a very warm welcome for them there. These also would mostly be identified, as I said, as Sephardi Jews. They would each create their own language, with Yiddish in Eastern Europe, Russian and Ladino among the Sephardi Jews. And now we enter the fifth day, the age of Messiah, and begin the times of great persecutions from the now established Church of the Roman Empire. Constantine moves to rewrite the teachings of Jesus and Paul to move them away from their Jewish roots and establish the Council of Nicaea to establish the only allowed beliefs in the new church. In order to make it appeal to his soldiers, he allows in many pagan rituals and ideas. Besides Christianity, this day will see the birth of Islam and even more persecutions. But as the sun dawns on the fifth day, there will be a time of rest for many Jews, as the Arabs who now controlled Spain and France will allow Jews many freedoms that the Christian nations had not. This is considered a golden age for study and writing, at any rate, with great Sephardi rabbis like Nachmanides and Maimonides, and even before them the Amoraim rabbis will add to the Mishnah their commentaries, completing the Talmud as a major teaching of the oral law. This was completed in the 6th century. By the time of Maimonides in the 12th century, he'll take the Talmud, which is a rather chaotic work, and systematize it into a much easier to follow explanation of the 613 commandments. His magnum opus will be called the Mishneh Torah. But as the sun sets on the fifth day, the persecutions and pogroms will intensify. Christianity will retake Spain and France, and the Jews will once again be forced to flee or convert. The Crusades will bring death and destruction. The Inquisitions and pogroms will cost many Jewish lives. But the beginning of the sixth day, or by the beginning of the sixth day, there would be some light that would shine through the darkness, as the Kabbalah and a renewed interest in mystical Judaism would take root. Rabbi Isaac Luria would spread this light through his teachings that would become known as Lurianic Kabbalism. The movement would flower in the 1700s with the emergence of the Baal Shem Tov, but there would be still great pain and darkness that would precede it. For this was still the night of the beginning of the sixth day, the day that we are still in now. So here again, just very briefly, this look of the things that took place. We have the continuation of the Talmud. As we said, the Mishnah began it by the Tamaim, and then the Gemara was added by the Amoraim, completing the Talmud. We have the Christianity established by Constantine. We have then the Jerusalem Talmud, which is separate from the Babylonian Talmud. There are two Talmuds, actually. The Babylonian Talmud is the primary one that is used today and is not very much different than the Jerusalem Talmud. The difference and the reason the Babylonian Talmud is used is the Jerusalem Talmud, because it was in Jerusalem and written in Jerusalem, which was very much under control of Christianity, was very censored, and so things had to be written in an obtuse kind of way, whereas the Babylonian Talmud had a lot more freedom to write various truths involved in it. So again, that's essentially the difference between the two. Both have many similar stories, contain many similar ideas, and very little, if any, contradictions between the two of them. So then we have the rise of the Persian Empire. The Byzantines rose, and they will be the ones who will take over and destroy Constantine's Rome, Constantinople. And then, of course, the Arabs, the rise of Islam. Rashi will become the famous commentator for the Torah in Spain, Crusaders in 1099. And then we have during all of this time here, we have the golden age of Judaism, where many teachers like Rashi, Maimonides, and Nachmanides would expound on the Torah. And of course, the Mishnah Torah itself, Maimonides being written around 4940 as we close Thursday and the 4,000 year cycle in our age, moving us to today's time, which is Friday. So as we move into the year 5000, we have a time of both great chaos, great conflicts, great problems for Israel, Judaism, but also some great lights, just as happened in the fifth day in Thursday. We see the same kind of process happening in the sixth day. And all of that process, as we look at the age of Messiah, this entire age is probably best represented as birth pangs. So we have false labor pains, times that are very painful, and yet there's no birth that takes place, just a lot of pain. But then the pain subsides, and we get a time of respite, a time of peace, so that we're still preparing for the birth, but it hasn't happened yet. So we'll go through that period as we went through it throughout the fifth day. We'll go through it and continue to go through it throughout the sixth day, where we have times of pain, but then the pain subsides, and we have times of joy at knowing that there's a birth coming. At any rate, in Eastern Europe, the Polish monarchy that had been friendly to the Jews will be overthrown. The 1600s was a time of wars and chaos throughout Europe, and considered by historians to be the bloodiest conflicts in human history, even worse than World War I would be. Millions of Jews would be massacred. Once again, Messianic fervor would permeate the Jewish hopes as the wars ended in the mid-1600s. This hope for a new world would not only grip the Jews, but also the Christians. The Puritans, who now controlled England, invited the Jews back in believing that this would hasten the return of their Messiah. In Eastern Europe, a Messiah did appear, a man named Shabbatai Zvi, who claimed the title and led thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of Jews, including many rabbis, to his side. But sadly, he wouldn't prove up to the task any more than Yeshua had, and once again a false Messiah would dash the hopes of the Jews. But it was now the dawning of the sixth day, and a new light would come into the world. Two important events would come out of this time of darkness: the Age of Enlightenment and the Hasidic movement, led by a man called the Baal Shem Tov. One would lead Jews away from God, the other would lead them back. The Age of Enlightenment began as a response to the bloody years preceding, the bloody years of wars that had preceded, as a philosophy that would see religion as the source of war and strife, and propose instead that man himself is better off without it. Man and science became more important than God and mysticism. For the Jews, this would lead to the Reform movement. The Baal Shem Tov in the early 1700s recognized the people's need for hope and joy in their lives, and he took the opposite approach to enlightenment. He taught that the people that there was a path to God that was more joy-filled than they had ever been taught before, feeling only the burdens of fulfilling commandments. He taught a mystical path that included the commandments, but also taught that God loved them dearly as long as they tried to do the right thing, even if they were not always successful. The Besht, as he was called, also helped the people move past the sadness of the Shabbatai Zvi movement by debating and defeating their philosophies wherever he could, showing the people that his way, the Baal Shem Tov's way, was far superior and far more beneficial to the people. There were many Orthodox rabbis that opposed him then and opposed the movement even today, but as the rise of Reform Judaism was taking place and uneasy peace was established between the emerging Hasidic movement and the Mitnagdim, or the Orthodox movement at the time, they joined together because they had now a common enemy to fight to support Torah-based Judaism. So again, we have all of these things happening during this time, the beginning of the sixth day, again leading to many times of pain. Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation happening in this time. Initially, Martin Luther was a friend of Israel, but when they choose to continue to not convert, he later became an enemy to Israel. Shulchan Aruch was written as another code of law or understanding of the 613 commandments. Again, a great light for Judaism at this time. We have America opening up, which had the potential for being a great light for Judaism, although many in Europe did not believe so, and saw many of the problems that would exist because of America. But at any rate, it is still a positive time where many Jews could escape to America and find freedom there. A wonderful story about George Washington and Israel. George Washington, a very great friend of Israel, and especially that there was in 1778, 79, there was a European Jew who actually donated millions and millions of what would be today's money for the establishment of of America. So at any rate, America became a very good place for Israel to be. But then we have in 1676, we have that emergence of Shabbatai Zvi, who led many Jews astray. His movement actually continues really through today. You can find descendants of his movement. After he died, about 100 years later, another man called Jacob Frank claimed to be a descendant, not a descendant, but claimed to be a reincarnation of Shabbatai Zvi, and continued his heresies and problems, and led many more astray. But again, that is a minor movement, but it still exists. The Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidic movement, of course, a much greater change and transformation for Israel, for the Jews, and exists today in some very positive ways, dealing with enabling Jews to find themselves and to find joy in the performance of the mitzvahs. Vilna Gaon was actually a member of the opposing force for Hasidism, and yet there were even times in the Vilna Gaon and his discussion of mysticism kind of sounded the same way. But then we have the Reform Judaism starting along with the Enlightenment in the 1800s, or about halfway through the day, Friday, 5578 being the date here. We have that being a huge division, if you will, among Jews, and most of the time this division began in Germany, but really in America is where it took root, and today even the most members of the Reform movement are in America as opposed to anywhere else in the world, and that is the first half of Friday of the sixth day. And now we move into a history that most of us are at least vaguely familiar with. For the next 500 years leading up to today, accelerated time and events for the Jews. America became a seemingly safe harbor, but many Orthodox and Hasidic Jews were very scared of moving here, because with religious freedom also came enlightenment for the Gentiles, and Reform Judaism had taken root here for the Jews. There was great danger in both, a danger that has proven to be true. Just as in Babylon, the Jews could live comfortably here as long as they were willing to abandon the traditions that had sustained the Jews for many centuries. Zionism also grew out of the Age of Enlightenment, and the desire for a Jewish homeland was not necessarily a desire to return to Torah. In Germany, the Jews also found a great deal of comfort, believed here too that if they would just abandon their religious traditions, they could be accepted by the Gentiles and live a peaceful and comfortable life. Unfortunately, Hitler would prove them wrong. Then in 1948, in the year 5708, Israel was manifested. At the first, the Hasidic and Orthodox rabbis opposed the nation, believing that only the Messiah could lead us home. But once the nation was established, They accepted it as the will of God. We've spoken in other places about Chaim Potak's work, The Chosen. If you want to learn more about this time, it's an excellent book to kind of give you the insights into both sides of this story. But his book, The Chosen, is a wonderful book about this time. Also, Leon Uris, The Exodus, James Michener's The Hajj are wonderful, well-researched fictional accounts of Israel's birth. So I would recommend those for you if you like reading historical fiction. The many miracles involved in the establishment and maintaining of Israel, well documented, proving that God still has a plan and purpose for his chosen people. They didn't lose that title nor God's protection. We have the Independence War in 1948, Six-Day War, where we have 50,000 Israelites versus 560,000 from 6 countries trying to destroy Israel. We have the 1967. We have the Yom Kippur War in October of 73, where we now have again about the same numbers, 6 times as many of our enemy opposing us. 1 million in Israel at that time. 400,000 in Israel at that time versus over 1 million from 6 countries that came against us. That was during the Yom Kippur War. Obviously, we won. Yay. We have the Camp David Peace Accords in 1978, but many believe that really did not do a whole lot because immediately after that we see the Lebanon War in 82 and again in 2005, the Palestinian War, 2000 to 2005, and of course in our times the Hamas War, which is really an extension of all the preceding ones in 2023, October 7th. So all of those things taking place that should have destroyed Israel. There's no reason we should exist other than it is God protecting and showing the importance of Israel to the world, which unfortunately the world hasn't gotten that message for the most part. The Messiah, okay, we have talked about this before. So both Christians and Jews believe that by the year 6000, the Messianic age will take place. It cannot, again, this is the idea in terms of prophecy, cannot take place after that, has to be before that. So it could be before, doesn't have to be, but it could be. So we look at that. So according to both Jewish and Christian scholars, this is the latest. 6000 is the latest that Messiah can come. But even though that's over 200 years away on the cosmic clock, where a day is 1,000 years, that's only a few hours. The Messiah must come prior to Shabbat for various reasons. But the bottom line is that it could be at any time now. We'll take a closer breakdown of that here in just a moment. Actually, I misspoke. I said we'll take a look at a breakdown about that here. We won't, from primarily time constraints here for this class. But I do have that discuss that in detail in the Messiah class. So I invite you to listen to that, especially towards the end of that class. You'll hear a lot more about the breakdown of the 6th day and where we're at and why it's very possible that the Messiah can come at any moment. What I want to look now is earlier we looked at all the empires who tried to destroy Israel and failed. So I just want to conclude, this is not a negative note. It is a positive note. Again, showing how God has protected us over time, which tells us and should tell the world at the importance of Israel to God and to the world. So let's conclude by looking at the major pogroms and persecutions we've endured in exile. Once again, we see the hand of God preserving us. So we have the Crusades, 1096, 1146, 1190. In all of those 3 crusades, we have incredible devastation and death dealt not only to Arabs, but also to Jews during this time. 1242 in France, and 1252 we have the Christian persecutions, the Inquisitions happening in 1252. Again, a very awful, very disgusting time in the history of the church's treatment of those that opposed them. 1298 in Germany, 1320 another set of crusades, 1336 in Germany, 1391 in Spain. We have Austrian pogroms, 1421, the huge pogrom in Poland in 1648, the Chmielnicki's massacres. Millions of Jews were killed in these pogroms. 1734, we have the Haidamaks. 1890, anti-Jewish riots in Germany. 1905, Russia. 1938, we have Kristallnacht in Germany. So a very devastating time. The other thing I want to point out, something that I often forget, we look at how Israel has been in exile for so many years, but remember also that we were actually in Israel for 1,400 years. It's hard to believe that when we don't think much about the times we were there, because the Torah kind of glosses over, the Tanakh glosses over those times. But we were there for almost 2,000 years, 1,500 years, in the land of Israel. And also, the initial conquest was 44 years, just to break that down. The time of the judges, 350 years. The time of the kings was 437 years. So these were times here that there was relative peace in Israel, if you will. At least they were mostly controlled and dominated by themselves, with, of course, other countries coming in and attacking from time to time. And then they were dominated. They were still in the land of Israel, but they were dominated by other countries, like the Greeks and the Romans, for 575 years. So we spent over almost 1,900 years in exile. We had, again, 849 of those years. If we look at all of this combined in terms of massacres and pogroms, and over 1,000 years of intolerance and subjugation. So we look at all of this, we see this seems to be a very negative thing, but at the same time, it is to the point that the main point is that we're still here, and we're still teaching and talking about the Torah and God's Word and God's faithfulness and God's love. That's the message. That's the message that we should get from the Torah, from all of this that's taking place, is that God is faithful. It may not seem it when we're in the midst of these things, and during this time we want the Messiah to come, and there have been many that have tried to proclaim themselves as Messiah during this time. But we're still here. We're still in exile, and we're still hoping for the Messiah to come and believing that it will happen very, very soon. One final note before we conclude our history: everything we need to know about where we are today in terms of Judaism can be learned from the first century. I believe that the same divisions that existed then exist now, and as we find proof in the faithfulness of God and the history of Israel, perhaps we can also find it in the divisions that have withstood the test of time. Of all the divisions that survived the first century and the exile to follow, the two strongest are the Pharisees and the Hellenistic Jews. The Pharisees, in my opinion, became the rabbis of today. The Orthodox, complete with the two schools from the first century, the Hasidic, who descended from the Baal Shem Tov, have a closer relationship with both Jews and Gentiles and their Shammai counterparts, who are more rooted in their desire for purity and separateness. So as I see here, the school of Hillel, that became the Hasidic branch, if you will, of Judaism today. And the school of Shammai became the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, also known as the Mitnagdim, before they became the ultra-Orthodox. These two groups still exist today. They're Pharisees. The next group, the Sadducees, whose power rested in the temple, seemed to disappear, but their emphasis on only obeying the written law as they perceived it and opposed the oral law, which they saw as a fabrication of the rabbis, reemerged as a relatively small group today, known as the Karaites. And the Hellenistic Jews, this is the largest group, who preferred to try and hide their Judaism by accepting the philosophies of the world rather than Torah and oral law, reemerged after the Age of Enlightenment as the Reform movement, which today, as in the first century, remains the largest group, especially if you count its offspring, the conservative and modern Orthodox streams, as well as the unaffiliated. This group began in Germany, as I said before, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, in the hopes that by more closely identifying with the world around them, they could be spared the violence of anti-Semitism. It obviously didn't work then, as it didn't work for the Hellenist Jews, and as it doesn't work today. And yet, as I mentioned, the conservative and modern Orthodox was a branch of Reform who decided they wanted to feel more observant Jewishly, but not to the extreme of Rabbinic Judaism. And then branching off of this group was modern Orthodox, who took an additional step towards Orthodoxy. But I would still join them to their parent movement, the Reform. Now, the comparison of the Zealots with the Zionists is admittedly very strained because the Zealots were extremely religious, and typically the Zionists, especially the early Zionists, were not. Still, both groups felt that they could assure the survival of their people by means of violence, by means of their personal strength and power. It's in this that I make the comparison. And finally, the Essenes. We know so little about them, and yet they exerted a great deal of influence in the first century. There are those who believe that the Rabbinic Judaism of today owes more to the Essenes than most realize. And there are those, of course, especially among Christians, who claim a kinship with this group through Jesus. So for now, it remains uncertain who might be representing this group today. The Essenes, and to some extent the Pharisees, were expecting the Messiah to appear at any time, as we were approaching the fifth day in the age of Messiah, as the third age is called. It was known and taught that the Messiah could appear at any time now. Yeshua was one of the many, and just like the rabbis today, held their followers close. Even death was not always an obstacle to the believers, because there was always a hope and a resurrection. So we see that as obviously in Yeshua, Shabbatai Zvi. We see that in his supposed reincarnation in Jacob Frank. We see that in today's time with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who has been dead for 3 decades plus, and yet still many of his followers believe he'll be resurrected and take the place of, or as the Messiah. So these are the things that we're looking at in terms of the history. Very brief discussion, and we'll conclude with just this reminder. This is the first in the class that is entitled Judaism 101. We will continue looking at other aspects of the history of Israel in other ways, through the lifestyles, through the writings, language, etc. We'll be taking a look at all of those in this class as we continue it. So again, this has been the history of Israel and the Jews. Join me for the next class. For Yeshiva B'nai Noach, I'm Tom Averna. Shalom.